It's amazing how meticulous and cruel fate can be at the same time. Have you ever stopped to think that the difference between a palace and an alley can be just a minute on a hospital clock? A minute that defines 30 years of life, that separates silk from the gutter, abundance from hunger, identity from complete anonymity. And that's exactly the story we're going to unfold today. A narrative that will make you question everything you think about luck, inheritance, and the merciless hand of chance. If you like stories that mix the impossible with the harshest reality, get ready for this deep dive into our channel, Stories of Millions, where we reveal the invisible threads that connect the most extreme lives. The scene actually begins in two very different cities, barely touching on the geographical map, but about to collide on the map of human suffering. On one side, we have Alexandra Varela, 30 years old, impeccable, with a haircut that would cost an entire family a month's rent. He didn't just wear fortune, he was fortune. Alexandra had just left a meeting where he had decided the future of thousands of employees of a multinational company. A cold decision based on numbers and projections, executed with the same ease as choosing a rare vintage wine. He lived in a penthouse that was more glass and silence than brick, with a view that swallowed the entire city. His life was a tapestry of high-level commitments, luxury cars that seemed to glide on the asphalt, and a social pedigree that placed him above most. He breathed filtered, air-conditioned air, free of dust and perhaps free of genuine emotion. On the other side, just 200 kilometers away, in the damp and forgotten heart of a neighboring metropolis, was Elias. Elias was 30 years old, but he looked like he had lived 60. His hands were calloused, marked by dirt that never completely came off, even after washing in the park's public drinking fountains. He slept under a pile of cardboard boxes that smelled of sour rain and despair. Elias didn't decide the fate of thousands. He fought for his own minute by minute, begging for a coin, a scrap of food to help him get through the coldest dawn. He was the literal opposite of Alexander, invisible, dirty, disposable, and yet there was something in his tired eyes, a depth that Alexander's detachment would never allow, that screamed an untold story. The hook here isn't just the contrast between wealth and poverty, but the shocking truth that connected them. They were born together. They shared the same womb, the same DNA, the same first cry of life 3 decades ago. The context of this absurdity begins on day 0, in an overcrowded public maternity ward, a place of both joy and chaos. The mother, a young single woman without resources, was taken by surprise by the arrival of identical twins. The shock of poverty was compounded by the astonishment of dual paternity. The tragedy was not the birth itself, but the context of despair that followed. In the midst of that confusion, the rush of exhausted nurses and lost medical records, the act occurred that would seal the fate of both. A wealthy, influential family, desperate to perpetuate their name and inherit their empire, had made a deal. They needed a child. They were unable to conceive, and time was running out. Using their contacts and an astronomical sum of money, they bribed a social worker and a head nurse, creating a perfect scheme for the illegal adoption of a healthy newborn. The initial plan was to take only one baby from the maternity ward, the first to be discharged or the easiest to disappear from the system. But when the biological mother gave birth to twins, the situation became complicated. The problem, the central conflict, lies in this moment of division. Why didn't they take both of them? The official version, which was never recorded, was that the mother, in a fit of panic and emotional overload, said she could only raise one. A pious lie, perhaps, or a distortion of reality created to justify greed. The fact is that the adoptive family, fearing that taking 2 newborns would attract too much attention, chose the baby who seemed stronger, who cried louder, who showed more vigor, the baby who would become Alexandra Varela. The other baby, Elias, remained, but not for long. The mother, already weakened by grief and financial pressure, and now without the support promised by the social services that had failed to protect her, simply couldn't bear it. 2 weeks later, she left Elias at the nursery of a public orphanage, her heart broken in a silence that would echo throughout the boy's life. She disappeared, swallowed up by the city and by regret. Alexandra, the abandoned baby, was taken to a life of marble and rules. He grew up surrounded by butlers, private tutors, and the suffocating pressure of being the perfect heir. He never knew he was adopted, as all records were altered and destroyed. The Varela family ensured he grew up with the conviction that this fortune was his birthright. This instilled in him a cold arrogance, an unwavering certainty that he was superior, a predator in the game of business. But internally, Alexandra always felt an emptiness, a lack of belonging, a melancholy that he tried to drown in work and wealth. He had everything, but he had no roots. Elias, for his part, grew up within the system, jumping from orphanage to foster home, facing indifference and often cruelty. He was just another number. When he turned 18, the system spat him out, without tools, without a solid education, without a safe haven. He fell into the streets, a beggar, a specter in society. Life taught him distrust and raw resilience. If Alexander had sterilized perfection, Elias had visceral survival instinct. He knew the name of every constellation he saw through the cracks in buildings and the smell of rain before it fell. Useless knowledge in Alexander's world, but essential in his own. The only living person who knows the truth about the twins is a former nurse named Cecilia. She lives in retirement in a small fishing village, tormented by the weight of the money she accepted and the life she helped destroy. She has kept a single document, an ultrasound clipping that proves the existence of the second baby, irrefutable proof that the separation was a mistake, a crime. We will now delve into the development of Elias's life on the streets. His routine was a litany of humiliation. He would wake up with the sun low, trying to dry his damp clothes in the icy morning breeze. His only possession of value was an old, worn and heavy leather jacket, which served as a blanket, pillow and armor. Elias had a sharp intellect, honed from the books he read in public libraries when the cold was unbearable, but he lacked the platform to use it. He watched the world go by in fast cars and felt like a ghost, invisible to hurried humanity. One of the few things he did was observe the luxury shop windows, especially a jewelry store in the city center, not out of envy, but out of fascination with the futility of encapsulated beauty. He imagined who would buy those pieces and wondered if that person was in fact happier. On a rainy day, the lives of Alexandra and Elias began to converge, not physically yet, but through a crucial event. Alexandra was being honored as Young Entrepreneur of the Year at a charity gala. The location, a 5-star hotel just a few blocks from the alley where Elias used to sleep. The media coverage of the event was massive. Alexandra, on stage, was speaking about social responsibility and the transformative power of philanthropy. His speech was empty, cold, but delivered with the conviction of someone accustomed to being applauded. He wore a custom-made tuxedo that seemed to have been sewn directly onto his skin. He was the image of unattainable success. Meanwhile, Elias was at the back of the hotel, searching for leftover food in the garbage containers. The smell of the luxury food, truffles, roast beef, champagne, was agonizing, a cruel reminder of the line that separated him from the party. He could hear the muffled music and loud laughter coming from inside the ballroom. He thought, this is what the other world smells like. This is the moment of re-engagement, the point where irony becomes unbearable. And that's why we insist on telling this story in stories of millions. They were separated by a wall, but united by a DNA that screamed without either of them knowing. One was toasting to success, the other was scavenging through the trash to survive. And the worst part, they had the same face. If you put them side by side, clean, dressed, with the same expression, it would be impossible to distinguish them. The only visible difference was their gaze. Alexander's, polished and distant, Elias's, hungry and experienced. The climax of our first part occurs when Alexandra's gala event ends. Tired of the flattery, Alexandra decides to leave early. He dismisses the driver and decides to walk a few blocks, needing fresh air, the night air that wasn't filtered by the air conditioning of his armored car. He turned a dark corner, away from the event lights, heading towards a shortcut that would take him to his street. What he didn't expect was the dark, hooded figure hunched over a trash can just 3 meters away from him. Elias stood with his back turned, his worn jacket almost blending into the shadow. He found a piece of bread that looked edible. As he turned around, the yellowish light from a flickering street lamp struck him from the side. Alexandra stopped breathing. The shock wasn't from encountering a beggar, as he saw dozens every day, but rather the face, Alexandra's body was seized by a dizziness. He saw the face he saw every morning in the marble mirror of his bathroom, but distorted by dirt, unshaven beard, and misery. It wasn't a resemblance, it was himself. It was as if the universe had shattered his reality. He blinked, thinking the champagne or fatigue were playing tricks on him. But the man was there, looking at him with the same confusion and a hint of hostility. Ilias, seeing the impeccably dressed man standing in the darkness, thought it was just another rich man judging him. Alexandra felt the emptiness he always carried in his chest close up, filled with a chilling terror. He couldn't move. He didn't see a double. He saw his own image projected in a nightmare of extreme poverty. Who was that man? How could he have the same eyebrow shape, the same jawline, the same subtle birthmark near his earlobe, which Alexandra thought was unique? Ilias, annoyed by the rich man's fixation, let out a hoarse grumble and turned to continue his search, quickly disappearing into the shadows of the alley. Alexandra stood there for a long minute, the stench of garbage, misery, and despair replacing the scent of his expensive cologne. Doubt had been planted. Far doubt so profound and terrifying that it threatened to dismantle the very foundation of his perfect life. That quick, dark encounter was no accident. It was fate settling the score for 30 years of secrecy. Alexandra Varela, the heir to millions, had just looked at his reflection in the gutter, and the image gave him no peace. He knew instinctively that the man he had just seen was not a stranger. It was his other half, the twin the system had forgotten, the ghost now returning to haunt his life of privilege. This is the foundation of the story, and the beginning of an investigation that will take us back to that maternity ward and the secrets kept under lock and key. The story is just beginning. You can't miss the next part, where we'll reveal Nurse Cecilia's past and how Alexandra begins his obsessive search for the beggar who shared his face. Stay tuned to Stories of Millions for the next chapter of this incredible journey. And it was there, in that paralyzing moment, that life, which until then seemed like a calculated and predictable straight line for one of them, twisted into an iron knot, a mirrored nightmare. You remember the shock of the first part of this story, don't you? If you don't remember, or if you're just arriving now, go straight to the Stories of Millions channel and check out the first part, because the depth of this only increases. The weight of the revelation wasn't just the fact that they were born at the same minute, from the same mother, but the tragic abyss that existed between their realities. One in an expensive suit, smelling of sandalwood and the promise of $1 billion business lunch. The other smelling of rain and wet asphalt, with the promise of only another cold night under the awning. Alex, the successful businessman whose Italian leather shoes had never seen mud, stood there, swallowing hard at the sight of himself, but 30 years worn down by hardness. His eyes scanned Benjamin's face, searching for traces of familiarity beyond their identical bone structure. He looked for a tic, a way of frowning that he himself used when dealing with financial crises, but all he found was the absence of comfort, the indelible mark of continuous struggle. Benjamin didn't have the smooth skin of someone who only sleeps on Egyptian cotton sheets. His skin was tanned, marked by winds and sleepless nights, furrowed not by wrinkles of expression, but by lines of exhaustion. It was as if nature had designed the same blueprint, but fate had used completely different materials. One in polished marble, the other in dry, cracked clay. The silence between them stretched out, dense, heavy as molten lead. It wasn't a silence of peace or contemplation, but a violent silence laden with unspoken accusations. Benjamin felt Alex's gaze upon him, not as the gaze of a brother, but as the gaze of a tourist looking at a historical ruin, with a mixture of pity and morbid fascination. And this irritated him deeply. All the accumulated anger of 30 years of deprivation, of humiliation, of painful winters, seemed to converge on that focal point, the expensive glint in his twin brother's wristwatch. 30 years. Benjamin's voice was a hoarse whisper, but heavy with grit. He cleared his throat, perhaps trying to remove the dust of a lifetime of misery. 30 years, you tell me, and where were you? Were you playing golf while I was, what? Scavenging for food in the trash? Alex closed his eyes briefly. Guilt was an acidic poison that began to burn his insides. He had been raised in a mansion, believing himself to be the only son. His adoptive father, a ruthless tycoon, had given him the world. Private schools in Switzerland, elite universities, the assurance that money was a problem solved. He had never questioned his luck, never stopped to think about the randomness of his existence. Until now. "I didn't know, Benjamin. I swear to God, I didn't know," Alex said, his voice trembling, which was rare for someone used to managing boardrooms full of apprehensive executives. "I only found out because my father, the man who raised me, left a series of encrypted documents before he died. He felt guilty, an old guilt. And it took me almost a year of heavy investigation to connect the dots. The original birth certificate, the maternity record, the payment slip for legal services. Legal services. That phrase hung in the air like a vulture. These weren't legal services for a legal and transparent adoption, because Alex knew now that his father had acted in the shadows, driven by an obsession with heirs and the need to hide his biological mother's humble origins. Alex's adoption had been almost a legalized kidnapping, a gigantic bribe in a time when control was lax and ethics were purchasable. Benjamin spat on the ground. It wasn't a vulgar gesture, it was an outburst of contempt. "Bribery," he muttered. "My whole life was sold for a piece of paper and a fat envelope, and yours was bought." This was the essence of the conflict that separated them, far beyond clothing or bank balances. It was the knowledge that a golden destiny had been actively stolen from the other, not by accident, but by a cold and calculated transaction. Alex, desperately trying to regain his trademark emotional control, pulled a thin leather folder from his briefcase. "I have everything here, Benjamin. My team's reports. The hospital's name, the admission and discharge records. Apparently we were separated just 48 hours after birth. I was taken directly to my adoptive parents' home. You..." Alex hesitated, his voice faltering. "You were left in the care of a state institution, classified as an orphan of unknown mother after a short period." "A state institution," Benjamin repeated. The laugh that followed was dry and bitter. "I remember state institutions, the smell of cheap Lysol and misery. I remember fighting for a piece of stale bread and being beaten for stealing a coat." He gestured with his hands, which were thick and calloused, full of old scars from cuts and burns, contrasting with Alex's thin, well-cared-for hands, which seemed made only for holding Mont Blanc pens and pressing buttons on touchscreens. "Look at our hands, Alex," Benjamin said, extending his own. It was almost a challenge. "Look, yours is the hand of someone who has never really worked. Mine is the hand that has built walls, moved garbage, begged. Do you think any amount of money can erase that?" Alex felt powerless. He was a man who could solve any problem with a 7-figure check, but here was a problem that money couldn't solve, only exacerbate. What could he offer? A house? Clothes? An education? Benjamin was already 30 years old. The wounds were too deep to be healed with luxury cosmetics. "I want to fix this," Alex whispered. Benjamin shook his head, the movement slow and painful. "It's not about fixing things. It's about understanding who did this and why. Your father, he's dead, you said. Great. Part of the truth died with him, but the whole truth didn't. They were now at the heart of the investigation, the point Alex had struggled to hide in his own reports, the open loophole that kept him from sleeping. The biological mother. The original documents indicated only the letter M and a common maiden name, Maria, perhaps. The birth was registered at a charity maternity hospital, a place that no longer existed. What happened to this woman? Did she know she had given birth to twins? Did she know that one was taken away and the other abandoned? Benjamin's pain was not limited to his own deprivation, but to the rejection of a mother who, presumably, had left him. "We have to find her, Benjamin," Alex said, patting the folder. "I haven't been able to track her down 10 days after she gave birth. It's like she's vanished off the face of the earth. But if she's alive, she has the answers." Benjamin crossed his arms, instinctively protecting himself, as if closing himself off from the cold. "What if she abandoned us, Alex? What if she rejected us both, or if she sold you and simply discarded me? Can you live with that answer?" The cruelty of the question hit Alex like a punch. He had fantasized that his mother was a victim, forced to give up one of her children due to extreme poverty, but loving the other enough to secure his future. The idea that she might have been complicit in the separation, or worse, that Benjamin had been the discarded burden, was unbearable. The investigation was progressing slowly and agonizingly, tracing through old documents, interviewing former maternity hospital employees. No one wanted to talk. A thick fog of omerta, of purchased silence, shrouded the events of that week 30 years ago. All of Alex's fortune couldn't penetrate the wall of time and institutionalized corruption. He had hired the best private detectives in the world, and they all came back with the same conclusion. The case had been cleaned up. However, there was a single name that appeared repeatedly in the margins of his father's financial documents, associated with adoption mediation services: Dr. Ilara Voss, a middle-aged social worker known at the time for operating in the grey area of international and private adoptions. She was the figure who had signed off on Alex's release to his new home, and curiously, had been the same person who had filled out Benjamin's orphan registration. "She's the bridge, Benjamin," Alex explained, sketching on a crumpled napkin from a cafe they could barely afford to sit at, a place Benjamin had chosen because it was as close as possible to his street life. She knew about both of us. She orchestrated the surrender of one and the abandonment of the other. Benjamin stared at the napkin, but saw only injustice printed in tiny letters. He no longer had faith in the justice of the system. The law was just another tool the rich used to polish their crimes. He deeply suspected Alex's motives. Was his rich brother doing this out of genuine remorse, or just to cleanse the moral stain on his conscience? "You're doing this to feel better about yourself, Alex," Benjamin accused, his voice low but sharp. "You're playing detective so that in the end, you can give me an allowance and say you've fulfilled your charity quota for the year." The accusation hurt Alex more than any market defeat. He took the watch off his wrist, a Patek Philippe worth more than the annual salary of many professionals, and placed it on the table, pushing it away. The glint of gold seemed obscene in that environment. "I don't need charity, Benjamin," Alex replied, his own pain beginning to show through in anger. "I'm a man who has everything, but no history. My history is a bought lie. If you think I'm doing this for fun or cheap philanthropy, you're wrong. I'm doing this because you're the only piece of my life that's real. You're proof that I'm not a figment of my father's money. You are my past. And if you don't want to look for the truth yourself, do it for me, because I need to know." It was a vulnerable plea, a crack in the armor of the ruthless businessman. Benjamin realized that, despite the expensive clothes and the bank account, Alex was just as much an orphan as he was. Alex was a true orphan, an orphan of identity. He had lost his family, his mother, and now, the truth about his origins. While Benjamin had lost comfort and opportunity, acceptance, albeit reluctant, began to emerge. They were two sides of the same shattered coin. To move forward, Alex decided to take a drastic measure that would jeopardize his reputation and potentially his fortune. He used his contacts to track down Dr. Ilara Voss, discovering that she had retired years ago and lived in seclusion in a small coastal town. The meeting would not be easy, and the woman, if she had any intelligence whatsoever, would not speak without prompting. "We're going there today," Alex declared, closing the folder with a dry thud. "I found her. She's alive. And we're going to force her to talk. She's the only one who knows if our mother is alive or dead. She's the only one who knows if you were abandoned or taken by force, Benjamin." Fear mixed with hope ignited a strange fire in Benjamin's eyes. He had lived his entire life accepting that he was a byproduct, a discard of society. But now there was an infinitesimal chance that his mother had been forced to give him up. That difference, forced versus abandoned, was what separated bearable pain from the total annihilation of the soul. And as they stood up to leave the cafe, Alex tossed a $100 bill on the table, an automatic gesture that Benjamin observed coldly. The social chasm hadn't narrowed, but the common goal, the search for Dr. Voss and the truth, bound them in a temporary and volatile alliance. The tension between them was palpable, a mixture of contempt and brotherhood, of anger and astonishment. They were the same man, but the world had spent its time polishing one and crushing the other under its weight. This journey in search of truth was only beginning, and you need to keep following every dense and emotional detail of this story that only the Stories of Millions channel can bring to you. Dr. Ilara Voss was the key, the guardian of 30 years of secrets. She had broken the family, and now Only she could begin the painful process of reconstruction. The path to the truth was about to open, but would the final discovery be liberating or destructive? The answer, my friend, is what you will discover in the next part of this saga that proves that destiny is merely a coin tossed by other hands. Don't go away. The next revelation will happen very soon here on Stories of Millions. This is Stories of Millions, and if you're here, you already know that life doesn't write scripts, it writes destinies. We continue to delve into the abyss that opened up when Leo, the immaculate tycoon, and Milo, the shadow born in the same instant, met. The first encounter had been a seismic shock, but the real catastrophe began the moment reality had to fit into the tapestry of Leo's life. Leo was a man who controlled everything: the stock market, his employees' schedules, the temperature of his coffee, and, crucially, the narrative of his own life. Milo was the personification of chaos, the unpredictable variable that threatened to implode the entire glass castle Leo had meticulously and coldly constructed. They were now, after a forced shower and clothes that smelled too new for Milo, sitting in a living room where silence was as precious as the art on the walls. The conversation that followed was not a family reunion, but a forensic interrogation. Leo couldn't stop staring. It wasn't just the physical resemblance, the slightly aquiline nose, the jawline. It was the distorted mirror staring back at him. Milo had the wrinkles of someone who had smiled too little and cried too much, etched by exposure to the harsh sun and icy winds. His eyes, which should have been identical to Leo's, the same unusual shade of grayish-green, were opaque, protected by a layer of distrust and exhaustion, like dusty windows that barely let the light in. "Tell me." Leo's voice was low, controlled, the kind of voice he used to close multi-million-dollar deals. How was it? Can you remember?" Milo laughed. It wasn't a cheerful laugh, it was a dry, hoarse sound that seemed to scratch the velvet of the sofa where he was sitting. "How was it? You're sitting in an ivory temple, Leo. You want a romantic retrospective of the filth? I remember the smell of garbage. I remember sleeping with one eye open, because the rat was my only company and fear my only blanket." The description, though brutally honest, seemed to fall into the room like a foreign object. Leo, accustomed to statistics and executive reports, couldn't process the stark reality of Milo's existence. He tried to categorize, to find a logical cause and effect for Milo's failure. "You never sought help?" "Opportunities," Leo pressed, the tip of a finger tapping lightly on the ebony table. It was an accusation disguised as a question, a manifestation of his philosophy that success was always a choice. Milo shook his head slowly, watching how the light reflected off his brother's perfectly trimmed nails. "You don't understand, Leo. Your world, the world of those who have, has invisible bars. For those born outside, the opportunity is to steal an apple or freeze to death. I didn't choose to be a beggar. I was made a beggar. And now you, who won the genetic lottery by a twist of fate, are judging me for my inability to climb a scaffold that never existed for me." The tension was palpable. Milo didn't want charity, he wanted justice, or at least an explanation of why. And that was the central question, the hook that tore Leo's soul apart. Why the separation? 30 years ago, something terrible and deliberate had happened in the maternity ward. Leo used all his influence and his most expensive lawyers to unearth the records. What they found was more disturbing than any simple administrative error. Leo's birth certificate was impeccable, clean, signed by the parents who raised him, wealthy, influential, but as suspected, not his biological parents. Milo's record, however, was a stain. An unclaimed baby, a gap in the paperwork, a child who simply disappeared into the system, thrown into the hands of a careless bureaucracy until essentially discarded. One of the lawyers called Leo, his voice strained. There were duplicate signatures, retroactive dates, and a suspicious amount of money transferred to a head nurse who had suddenly retired at the time. This wasn't a crib mix-up, this was theft. The knowledge of this theft changed the dynamic between the brothers. Leo stopped seeing Milo merely as a burden or a failure and began to see him as a victim, and worse, as proof that the foundation of his own life was a lie. If he, Leo, was raised by wealthy parents, that meant he was also taken from his biological parents. The fortune he inherited and built was founded on betrayal. "We weren't orphans, Milo," Leo whispered, his voice faltering for the first time, his steel mask slipping. "We were taken from us. Someone separated us and chose who would get the gold and who would get the mud." In this moment of vulnerability, the contrast was even more stark. Leo, wearing a silk robe, collapsing under the weight of the truth. Milo, wearing a sweatshirt Leo had bought, warm but not his, watching Leo with a cold wisdom, acquired over years of seeing the ugly side of humanity. "Welcome to the Truth Club, brother," Milo replied, a bitter trace of irony in his tone. "I've lived without illusions for 30 years. You're only beginning to wake up." This initial discovery, the certainty of an evil plan, was the first step toward their union, not in affection, but in purpose. The search for identity had become a hunt for revenge. And if you're enjoying this deep immersion and drama that transcends chance, don't forget to like and subscribe to Stories of Millions. You won't want to miss what we discover next. Leo, in his usual need for control, tried to impose order on Milo's life. He rented a luxury apartment, provided clothes, bank accounts, even a therapist. But Milo wasn't a makeover project. He was a survivor shaped by harshness. The luxury was claustrophobic. The apartment was too quiet. Milo spent his nights on the balcony, gazing at the city lights, missing the constant, even chaotic bustle of the street. The silence of wealth felt like a vacuum, a constant reminder that he didn't belong there. "I need air, Leo. This place reeks of money and sterility. It reeks of polished lies." Milo sighed one day, throwing away a designer suit that Leo had insisted he wear. Leo, who viewed cleanliness and order as moral virtues, was offended. "Are you rejecting the chance of a decent life? Are you clinging to misery?" "I'm clinging to my truth," Milo shouted, for the first time letting his pent-up anger overflow. "I've spent my whole life being invisible. You give me a marble room and think you've erased 30 years of trauma. That's not how it works, Leo. I'm not an item you buy and fix." The conflict escalated. Leo realized that giving money wasn't enough. He needed to understand the true cost of that separation. And for that, he needed the memories that Milo had and that he himself didn't. In an effort to connect, Leo made a mistake that would prove crucial. He took Milo to his office. Not just any office, but the sanctuary where he planned empires. It was a space with glass walls, a panoramic view of the entire metropolis, and a single shelf that held objects that, for Leo, were symbolic of his rise. Milo walked through the office with the caution of someone entering a trap. He stopped in front of the shelf. There was a framed photograph of Leo's adoptive parents, smiling but fake. There were entrepreneurship awards, and there was a small, worn wooden item that seemed completely out of place amidst the crystal and metal. It was a small, crudely made toy rocking horse with peeling paint. Leo picked up the object, his expression softening into a rare melancholy. "My adoptive father gave it to me. He said it was the first thing he gave me when they took me out of the hospital." Milo reached out, his calloused fingers brushing against the cold wood. In that instant, a pattern of interruption occurred in Milo's mind. A fragmented memory, a sensory flash. Not visual, but tactile. "No," Milo said, his voice strained almost a groan. "It's not his. I remember it. I remember the smell of sawdust and old oil. I remember the sound. It creaked. I used it. We used it." The air in the room became thick and cold. Leo looked at his brother, perplexed. "You can't remember this. You were a baby." "I don't know how," Milo insisted, squeezing the toy in his hand. "But I remember a warmth that wasn't of this steel world. There was a hand, a big strong hand swinging it, and I was on the other side. We were together, Leo, for a while, before someone came and took you away and left me behind. If the separation had been a simple mistake, neither of them would have any memories of before. But if Milo, the twin who was discarded, had this sensory memory of a shared time, it meant they were raised together, even if only for a few weeks or months, before the separation plan was executed. This wasn't just identity theft, it was the meticulously planned destruction of a family. The revelation was devastating for Leo. His adoptive parents hadn't just taken him, they had stolen him from an existing home, however humble. The wooden toy, the only artifact of his childhood, wasn't a symbol of his adoptive parents' love. It was the only physical vestige of the betrayal that cemented their fortune. Leo's identity began to dissolve. Who was he? The successful businessman or the stolen baby? That wooden horse was proof that Milo's life was what his life should have been, and vice versa. The DNA test results came in, confirming what their souls already knew. A 99.9999% chance they were identical twins. Science closed the loop of coincidence. Fate, however, opened a new and dangerous mystery. They were now certain, but not why. Who were his biological parents? Who was the large, strong hand that rocked that wooden horse? And most terrifyingly, who were the monsters who orchestrated this exchange of lives, condemning one to wealth and the other to darkness? The search for truth became the sole purpose of their shared lives. Leo would use his money and power to dismantle the past. Milo would use his survivor's cunning to navigate the sewers of lies. They were the same person, now on opposite sides of a battlefield fighting against the history that had been imposed upon them. The next step would be to confront Leo's adoptive parents, those responsible for raising the tycoon while the beggar languished. But the question lingered. Did they know everything? And if so, what else were they hiding? Tension was rising, and the truth threatened to destroy not only their fortune, but their sanity as well. To find out who the real villains are in this saga of stolen destinies, you need to stay tuned. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and keep following Stories of Millions. The truth behind this separation will be far more shocking than you imagine. If you're just arriving now, know that this is part 4 of a story that transcends any fiction you've ever heard. Proof of how cruel, or simply indifferent, fate can be. And that only here at Stories of Millions will you find the complete conclusion to this insane journey. The air in Alexander's meeting room was so thick it felt cuttable, an invisible gas made of 30 years of absence, guilt, and privilege. The documents, methodically stacked on the imported mahogany table, were irrefutable proof, cold and relentless scientific confirmation. Alexander, the magnate who had built an empire on logic and predictability, was now facing the greatest and most absurd anomaly of his life. Elias, the man who smelled of rain and asphalt, the beggar who lived in the shadows, was himself. The exact copy, the distorted reflection of everything he had become. Elias, for his part, sat on the edge of the leather armchair, the expensive material seeming to repel his ragged figure. He couldn't take his eyes off the DNA chart, not because he understood the genetic complexity, but because that sheet was the accounting record of his misery. Each percentage of similarity was a slap in the face, a receipt showing the exact value of everything that had been stolen from him: the warm bed, the breakfast, the embrace of a mother he never had, the chance to be Alexandra. The silence was broken by Alexandra's private lawyer, a meticulous man named Dr. Vasconcelos, who cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses, visibly uncomfortable with the operatic drama unfolding before him. He had the job of summarizing 30 years of pain in legal and bureaucratic terms, and it was there, in the coldness of the investigation report, that the story ceased to be a simple hospital error and began to take shape as a cold and calculated conspiracy. "The initial data, gentlemen," began Dr. Vasconcelos, his voice dry and professional, indicated an accidental mix-up of babies at the Santa Clara Maternity Hospital 30 years ago. A gross error of identification, perhaps, given the precarious conditions of the time and the volume of births. However, we deepened the investigation, analyzing internal records, testimonies from former employees, and, most crucially, the discharge charts. Elias clenched his fists, feeling the sweat trickle down. He didn't want bureaucracy, he wanted to know who he needed to hate. "Your biological mother, Mrs. Helena," Vasconcelos continued, leafing through a file, "was admitted for a twin birth. That's documented. What wasn't clear, and which we only discovered by accessing the archived death records, is that on the day of discharge, only one baby, Alexandra in this case, was taken home. Elias's medical record at the time registered death due to severe respiratory failure a few hours after birth. A record that, analyzed today by our forensic and medical team, appears inconsistent and fabricated." Alexandre raised his hand, a gesture that usually stopped speeches in administrative councils, but which seemed pathetic here. He needed control. "What you're saying, Doctor, is that there was document forgery, that it wasn't a mistake, but a deliberate act." Vasconcelos' voice lowered, heavy with seriousness. Yes, Alexandra. Someone at the maternity ward, with privileged access and perhaps handsomely paid for it, ensured that Elias was listed as dead in the official records, releasing him to be taken away and, presumably, abandoned or given to third parties with the guarantee that the deceased brother would never be sought. At that moment, the difference between the twins manifested itself physically. Alexandra recoiled, placing his hand on his chest as if the information were a physical weight, the collapse of his perfect reality. Elias, however, moved forward, his thin body tense like a guitar string about to snap. Abandoned! Elias spat out the word, and it reverberated through the luxurious room like an insult. I wasn't delivered. I was thrown away, thrown in the trash so as not to spoil the beautiful picture of the rich family. Alexandra tried to appeal to reason. Elias, control yourself. We have to understand the why. If someone paid, if someone orchestrated this, there was a reason. It wasn't random. Reason? Elias laughed, a harsh, humorless sound that seemed to tear at his throat. He stood and walked to the enormous glass window overlooking the city, the world Alexander had inherited. The reason is obvious, Alexander. Do you think 2 first-rate heirs would be welcome in a family that only values pure and controlled lineage? One was enough. The other was a risk, a dilution of power, an extra cost. This accusation hit Alexandra hard. He had never thought of his birth as a market asset, but rather as a right. The idea that his own existence was based on discarding his brother disgusted him. He felt like a parasite even though he owned everything. It's not fair to blame me for my parents' greed, Alexandra defended himself, his voice heavy with a pain he rarely allowed to surface. I didn't know. I lived a lie too. A lie with a heated pool and a private driver, Elias retorted, turning away with flames in his eyes. You lived the lie I should have lived. And now, tell me, who was it? Who signed my death certificate? Dr. Vasconcelos coughed again and presented an aged document. Here's the first pattern breaker in the investigation, he said, using an intelligence term that sounded strangely out of place. The person who signed the death certificate, a head nurse named Dolores Ribeiro, wasn't just an employee of Santa Clara. She had distant family ties to your paternal family, Alexandre. Affinity, a third cousin, but enough to suggest that this wasn't an anonymous transaction, but rather a favor done internally, keeping the secret within the circle of influence. This revelation cast an even greater shadow over Alexander's paternal figure. The father, a respected man in society, a pillar of moral integrity, was now implicated in a heinous crime. The betrayal was twofold. He betrayed the son he abandoned and betrayed the son he raised under a lie. Alexandra felt the world spin. His parents, always seen as untouchable as models of righteousness, were the architects of his downfall. And it is this web of lies that we are unraveling, step by step, detail by detail, here at Stories of Millions. Don't you dare leave, because what's coming will make you question the truth of your entire life. Dr. Vasconcelos continued, detailing the logistics of the separation, an exercise in coldness that should have been reserved for war reports, not a family history. He explained how in those first hours of life, Elias was replaced by a stillborn baby from another family, whose documentation was switched with Elias's. The stillborn baby was then quickly cremated under the name Elias, while the real Elias was taken from the maternity ward by Nurse Dolores and delivered to a clandestine religious institution on the outskirts of town, under the pretense of being an abandoned child found in a box. The religious institution, the doctor pointed to a photograph of a dilapidated building, operated outside the oversight of the state. It was a place where wealthy families sent mistakes or unwanted children. This ensures that Elias was never officially registered in any legal system, making his location nearly impossible, except by the luck and persistence of our private investigator 30 years later. Luck. Elias thought about it. His entire life had been determined by luck. The luck of having survived the neglect of the orphanage, the violence of the streets, hunger and cold. A perverse luck that kept him alive only to confront the reality that he could have suffered Alexander's fate. Elias began to walk around the room, running his hand over a shelf of rare books. He could smell the money, a scent that would never leave the clothes and carpets. "And what did my mother know?" Elias asked, his voice less aggressive, more laden with a childlike plea. She knew she had given birth to twins and only took one. That was the question that hung in the air like a nuclear threat. The figure of Helena, their mother, was the last bastion of innocence that Alexandra tried to protect. He remembered her as an elegant, loving woman, but also extremely submissive to her father. Vasconcelos hesitated. Helena's records after childbirth show a period of profound depression and constant sedation for months, attributed to the loss of her son. However, there are notes from a private nurse that mention Helena's hysterical crying spells, where she repeated, "It wasn't supposed to be like this. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I saw him." Alexandra stood up abruptly. "That's speculation, doctor. My mother was grieving. She lost a son. She was fragile. Either she lost the battle to keep him," Elias interjected, his voice cutting like glass. "Do you think she would have allowed a son to be thrown out into the street if she had a choice?" Her father, Alexandra, her father was the one who orchestrated this horror show. He was the puppet master. The tension between them escalated. It was no longer a fight between the rich and the poor, but a fight between two brothers over the memory of a mother who was perhaps as much a victim as Elias. "My father is dead, Elias," Alexander said, his voice breaking. "We cannot confront him." "But we can confront the truth," Elias shouted, throwing a hardcover book to the floor. "Do you think it's a coincidence that your great-aunt, your father's sister, the matriarch who controls the trust funds, insisted that all the maternity ward records be digitized and destroyed under her supervision 10 years ago, citing archive reforms? Dr. Vasconcelos found the documentation because it was in parallel files hidden by a former employee of your security company. The investigation kept revealing new layers of corruption. The separation seemed to be just the beginning of a series of family cover-ups aimed at protecting the honor and patrimony of the House of Albuquerque, Alexandra's family. The web of complicity involved not only the deceased father, but also the living and influential figure of the great-aunt, a feared and respected woman who had always ruled the clan with an iron fist. The big reveal in Part 4, the climax of the escalating conflict, wasn't who separated the twins, but who is actively trying to bury the truth. Dr. Vasconcelos placed the last document on the table, a photo of Great-Aunt Lucia, an elderly woman with penetrating eyes and a smile that seemed to hold centuries of secrets. Great-Aunt Lucia is the only living person who was in her father Alexandra's inner circle at the time. She worked in the management of the family's charity foundation, which, coincidentally, funded maternal support projects in the vicinity of the Santa Clara Maternity Hospital. The connection is unavoidable. She is the loose end we need to pull. Alexandre looked at the photo of his great-aunt. That woman, who had always treated him with a distant but proper coldness, who was the guardian of the family values, was now the prime suspect in orchestrating, or at least covering up, Elias's disappearance. The betrayal was complete. He was supporting, with his own money and status, the web of lies that had stolen his brother's life. Elias, seeing the paralyzing shock on Alexander's face, felt a strange wave of dark satisfaction. The rich man was bleeding too. He was a victim too. "She won't speak to you, Alexandra," Elias declared, his voice low but firm. "You're the heir she manipulates. But maybe if she sees me, the ghost she tried to bury, maybe she'll break." The room fell into absolute silence. Elias, the beggar, was proposing to them the next and dangerous step, confronting the matriarch, the woman who had written the script for their double life, the woman who held the keys to the why of the separation. Alexandra took a deep breath, closing the investigation file. The fear of destroying what remained of his family was losing out to the need to know the truth. He looked at Elias, seeing for the first time not a miserable reflection of himself, but an unlikely ally in the search for justice. "Dr. Vasconcelos," Alexandre ordered, his voice returning to its natural, cold, executive tone, "arrange a meeting, an unofficial meeting, in a neutral location. We want to see Great-Aunt Lucia." "And Elias," he looked at his brother, whose gaze was pure fire, "you're coming with me." The stage was set. The brothers, united by pain and betrayal, would confront the guardian of the secret, the matriarch who determined who would live in the light and who would rot in the darkness. And you can't miss the shocking ending and the explosion of emotions that's coming in Part 5, only here at Stories of Millions. Don't go away. The conclusion is unmissable. If you're just arriving now, you need to understand that this isn't just another story. This is the culmination of a tragedy disguised as destiny, a tale that could only be unearthed here at Stories of Millions. Prepare yourself, because the abyss that Elias and Gabriel are about to face is deeper, colder and more cruel than anything you could imagine about human nature. The silence in the small disused filing room at the back of the old maternity ward was a physical weight that threatened to crush the ribs of the two brothers. Elias, the magnate, had a pale, sweaty face, his impeccable posture for the first time in his life seeming fragile. Gabriel, the man who had known the cruelty of the streets, trembled not from cold, but from a pent-up rage that threatened to explode, a rage that stemmed from 30 years of hunger, humiliation, and hopelessness. Before them, seated at the formica-stained table, was Dr. Sophia, now an 80-year-old woman whose myopiled eyes, behind thick-rimmed glasses, seemed to see through walls, but could not face the reality she herself had orchestrated. She was the last link, the missing piece, the guardian of the secret that had divided lives and fortunes. "Please, Doctor." Elias's voice came out hoarse, unrecognizable. "We have the transfer records, the payment made in the name of the Montenegro family. Tell us the truth. Why was Gabriel discarded?" Sophia sighed, a drawn-out, agonizing sound that seemed to have escaped her lungs decades ago. She picked up a lace handkerchief and brought it to her dry lips, postponing the inevitable. The smell of mothballs and dust mingled with the fear emanating from the three bodies in the room. "It wasn't a choice. It wasn't a mistake in filling out the medical record," she began, her voice trembling but surprisingly firm, like a cracked bell. "It was a transaction. The family that took you, Elias, the Montenegros, were obsessed with lineage. They had tried for years to have an heir. When your biological mother gave birth, and they learned it was twins, they saw an opportunity, but also a risk." Gabriel stepped forward, his fists clenched. Elias's protective instinct ignited, and he gripped his brother's arm. "What risk?" Gabriel hissed. "The risk of imperfection," Sophia replied, and the word echoed like a gunshot. At the moment of birth, Elias was slightly larger, more robust. You, Gabriel, were the more fragile one, which required a few extra minutes of attention. The Montenegro emissary, a cold and calculating lawyer, saw this as a sign. He wanted the best. He paid an exorbitant sum to ensure that the perfect heir was registered as their son and left the clinic immediately. And as for the other one, she stopped, unable to finish the sentence. The truth hung there, nauseating. The more fragile twin, the one who needed more care, was simply discarded, considered a biological risk or worse, a defective product by the aristocratic coldness that sought perfection above all else. They made sure the mother was informed that one of the babies had died during childbirth, Sophia continued, tears streaming down her face. They paid for Gabriel's papers to be incinerated, so he would be left on the doorstep of an orphanage, far enough away that he would never cross paths with the Montenegro family or his biological mother. The revelation hit Elias with the force of a tidal wave. His entire life, the Swiss boarding school, the summers in Tuscany, the billions he inherited, was a monument built upon pain and the calculated abandonment of his own blood. He wasn't just a lucky twin, he was the result of a class crime, where wealth bought not only comfort but also life and destiny. So, if I were the weakest, I would have been the beggar. Elias's voice was almost a whisper of utter disbelief. Sophia simply nodded, unable to utter any more words. Gabriel released the breath he seemed to have held for 30 years. The pain he felt was no longer the pain of hunger, but the pain of being consciously rejected, of having his destiny stolen by a maternity ward scale and a bribe check. He was the unwanted byproduct of a pregnancy that produced the heir. Elias's inner conflict was monumental. He looked at Gabriel, at the scars on his hands, at the chronic sadness lodged in his identical eyes. He saw, for the first time unfiltered, the cosmic injustice that had separated them. He realized that the luxury of his life was the price of his brother's misery. Guilt crushed him. This is the raw material of destiny, the kind of revelation we only find when we dig deep into forgotten stories. That's why Stories of Millions exists, to unearth the cruelty and sometimes the redemption that follows. If you're feeling the same intensity of this discovery, know that the climax is yet to come. The next hour was spent revisiting the records Sofia had kept hidden, not out of loyalty to the Montenegros. The family had died in a helicopter accident years ago, leaving Elias as the sole heir, but out of sheer fear of the law and exposure. There were copies of checks dated 1993, an internal memo detailing the need to eliminate ties with the secondary specimen, and finally, the original record of the biological mother confirming the name, Helena Vasconcelos. With the evidence in hand, the need for justice outweighed the pain. Elias immediately contacted his law firm in New York, activating the best investigation and asset restitution team. The fight was no longer about who they were, it was about how to reverse 30 years of injustice. Gabriel, surprisingly, was calmer. He had absorbed the harsh truth. He wasn't accidentally poor, he was deliberately poor. The hatred he felt now was focused, directed at the coldness of a system that valued money above life. Elias approached his brother, extending his hand not for a handshake, but to touch his shoulder. "Gabriel, I'm so sorry. I know my I'm sorry means nothing compared to what you went through. But this ends now. Everything that's mine is ours. The companies, the assets, the house. I can't live with this knowing you were starving while I was learning to play golf." Gabriel hesitated, the conflict visible on his face. To accept Elias's offer was to accept the very injustice that had robbed him, but to reject it was to deny the only blood family he had left, and, perhaps, to deny himself the opportunity for peace. "I don't want your charity, Elias," Gabriel said, his voice low but firm. "It's not charity," Elias replied, his eyes brimming with a profound sincerity that Gabriel had never seen before, not from his brother, but from anyone. "It's restitution. It's the only way I can look at myself in the mirror. You are my brother, Gabriel. The mistake was that we thought you were dead. The crime was that we were separated. Wealth is just a tool. Let's use it to build something, together. Not as a rich man and a former beggar, but as equals." This mutual acceptance marked the true emotional climax of the story. It wasn't just the reunion, but the recognition that, despite the socio-economic distance, they were cut from the same cloth. Injustice had created an insurmountable gap, but truth became the bridge. The next step was to find Helena Vasconcelos, the biological mother who believed she had lost a son. She lived modestly in the countryside, dealing with the pain of grief for 3 decades. The scene of their reunion was indescribable. When Elias and Gabriel, identical in appearance, stood before her, the woman fainted. The shock mixed with euphoria was too much to bear. Upon waking, the explanations came, slow and painful. Helena's tears as she embraced Gabriel were the final proof, the closure of the wound that motherhood had opened. She cried not only for the son who reappeared, but for the heinous betrayal that had caused her to lose 30 years of companionship. The final conclusion needed to be practical and definitive. Elias kept his promise with absolute rigor. He didn't just divide the assets, he integrated them. Gabriel didn't become a silent partner or a dependent. He assumed a leadership position in the philanthropic arm of the Montenegro companies, transforming his experience of life on the streets into a mission to help those whom the system had forgotten. The following months were a period of intense adaptation. Gabriel had to learn to live with comfort, with the security of a roof over his head and guaranteed meals. Elias had to learn to value what money couldn't buy, the resilience and moral fortitude his brother had acquired in the struggle for survival. They were the yin and yang of the same soul, now finally united. The fate of Dr. Sofia was left in the hands of time. Elias and Gabriel chose not to prosecute her criminally, understanding that she was merely a corruptible piece in a much larger and more cruel scheme. The exposure of the facts, the destruction of her prestige, and the weight of her conscience were punishment enough. The great Montenegro family, which had been extinguished in an accident, left behind a legacy of cruelty that would be rewritten by the twins. Montenegro's fortune was renamed the Vasconcelos Montenegro Fund, with half of the assets directed to a new foundation focused on combating extreme inequality and protecting abandoned children. The beggar and the tycoon, now co-presidents of a financial and moral empire. They chose to live close to each other, but while maintaining their individuality. Elias continued his life in international business, but with a new moral compass. Gabriel built his own house, simple and solid, rejecting ostentation but accepting well-deserved comfort. Their last significant encounter occurred on their 31st birthday, the first they celebrated together. Looking at each other, reflected in their identical eyes, there was no longer the rich man or the beggar. There was only Elias and Gabriel, two men united by blood and an unbelievable history of injustice, who found in brotherhood the only currency that truly mattered. The case of the twins separated at birth, one condemned to opulence and the other to misery, is a stark reminder. Destiny may be written by greed, but redemption is written by truth. And that truth, though it took 30 years, was finally delivered. If you were touched by this saga of twists and turns and the triumph of justice over cruelty, you know that this type of story, which defies fate and exposes the depths of the human soul, is only possible here. For more stories that reveal the world's most shocking secrets, where money meets drama and the truth is always stranger than fiction, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video. That's the power of Stories of Millions. Until the next shocking revelation.